May I preach to you today in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. So if you look up at the slide here for a moment, this is a representation of something that probably, I hope every person in this room has seen. And it's a test to determine whether or not you're colorblind. Now, this one right here is kind of from a children's site, so that it's more vivid and, easier to see in that aspect. But I remember the first time that I actually had a chance to go and have my eyes checked as a child and being able to notice, oh, look, there's a number in there somewhere. And the optometrist saying, well, good, that means you're not colorblind. But it made me wonder as I got older, what are the different kinds of blindness? Because there's color blindness, there's actual face blindness where a person cannot recognize the human face or features of a human face. And then it, of course, evolved into a reflection on spiritual blindness. Because there's different kinds of spiritual blindness that a human being can suffer from. And we see that today in the parable that Jesus tells to the Pharisees. Now, to keep in mind, whenever Jesus tells a parable, he's trying to tell a story that looks like it's going to go one way, when in actuality, he's going to turn it on the audience and it actually becomes something different. So while this parable to us might seem very straightforward, to the people who heard it at the time, it wasn't. And so we have these two very different characters. We have the rich man who, feasts sumptuously every day, who wears this royal type of clothing. And then, of course, we have Lazarus, whose poverty is so deep that it is physical poverty, it is probably a despair kind of poverty, all these types of poverty that he's experiencing. And I haven't met a person, probably just as back then as today, I haven't met a person who would want to be Lazarus versus the rich man. I mean, I think all of us kind of would prefer to be the rich man versus Lazarus. But for the Pharisees and the scribes of the day, it wasn't just that they preferred, it's that they thought that if you were the rich man, it's because God loved you. You must be doing something right in your life if you are the rich man who's feasting sumptuously every day and living in a very large place. And that if you were Lazarus, that you probably have done something wrong in your life for God not to favor you. And the sad news is that a lot of that thought still lingers to this day. It's very easy to assume that those who are very wealthy are also very happy. But we know that's not necessarily the case. And we sometimes may believe that those who are incredibly poor, that it's their own fault. And we know that's not necessarily the case. So what kind of blindness was this rich man suffering from? Well, he was suffering from a very specific kind of spiritual blindness called indifference. So if you look very carefully at the story, where was Lazarus laying in his poverty? By the man's gate. Which means that every single time he entered and exited his home, he would see this man laying there almost like a carcass right next to his door. And at some point, he stopped seeing Lazarus. At some point, he just became blind. He couldn't see the figure anymore. And his indifference took over, and Lazarus just kind of fell into the background like a shrub or some rocks. And so his sin was really indifference. And there's three that I want to bring up today that we have to be careful of as individuals and as a congregation when we talk about spiritual blindness. The first is indifference. It is very easy to drive around, to go around, and just kind of ignore some of the poverty that's around us. I remember living in South Florida and visiting downtown Miami, and somebody telling me, you know, they talk about all these poor people, but I can never see them. And I go, have you driven in the downtown area of like really any city? You're going to find somebody who is homeless and poor. And so we cannot let those individuals just slip into the background and fade into the background, as it is very tempting to do. And so indifference can't be our sin. The second one is judgment. And this one is very hard, because I admit it is hard for me that when I see somebody who is poor and who has declared a need, that I don't immediately rush to judgment. There was I find it embarrassing for myself because I'm really supposed to know better, but I remember I was at a stoplight. This is when I was working at my previous parish, and the only way to exit was to make this precarious turn into the middle of the intersection and then wait for the light so you could make a U-turn and go in the other direction. And I was 4 cars back, and this gentleman had a sign that said, "Need money," you know, "need food." And of course I'm dressed in my uniform, and I'm just kind of praying, come on, change, change, change. Where's the green light? Because I did not want to engage with this man. I'd seen him before, I'd given him something before, and in my mind all I could think of was, come on, get it together. And I'm very ashamed, because when he came up to the door, just as he was maybe that car ahead of me, I kind of took the tab out and put it to the side there. So easy to do. And then the light changed, and I went and got out of the way. I got about a half a mile before I said, Lord, what did I just do? That was a terrible thing on my part to do. And it made me realize that I had judged this person to the point that I was now indifferent to their need. And we have to be careful of that. The last type of spiritual blindness which we have to be careful of is despair. If you turn on the news at any point on any day, we're going to see something that doesn't just upset us, but really practically depresses us. It's a hurricane, it's an earthquake, it's a natural disaster, it's a government crumbling, it's something that causes people to be in need in such a way that the need just appears to be completely overwhelming. And we ask ourselves, what can I do? I'm just one person. Now, I can write a check for $50 and send it to Episcopal Relief and Development, which is a wonderful thing to do. But then we kind of sit back and say, now what? I felt like I put a single drop into a desert's worth of suffering. Why even bother? And that despair can really stifle and eliminate the outreach of individuals and of churches. Because there are going to be some people and some disasters that we come upon where we're not going to fix it. We're not going to be able to fix it right away. We're not going to be able to heal it right away. But we will be able to make some kind of difference. And this is especially hard when it comes to people, because there are people who come to the church who are broken and hurt and poor, and no matter sometimes how much we put into them, it doesn't seem to fix their problem or fix them. And so we can feel a real sense of despair. So what's the cure for these 3 sins? The sin of indifference, the sin of judgment, and the sin of despair when it comes to dealing with poverty. Well, let's think about what Jesus did. He's always a good example, right? Jesus comes into a world and into a society that there's so much suffering, he literally cannot handle it. If you remember when Jesus begins proclaiming the gospel right after he's rejected in his hometown of Nazareth, he goes to this town and everybody seems to be bringing all of the poor and the sick and the dying and possessed from the entire city right to his doorstep. And he's doing his best to heal them and heal them. And at some point he has to stop. He is physically and emotionally and spiritually exhausted. And he has to go off for a while and pray. And when he leaves that, he tells his disciples, we've got to keep going to the next town. We've got to keep going to the next place because my mission is to proclaim the kingdom. Even if it means leaving all these other people who are still hurting behind. So how did Jesus serve those people? Well, the first thing is he actually saw them. He noticed them. When he walked by them, he didn't kind of put his hand up here and pretend I don't see it. He actually noticed them. The next thing he did was he saw the divine spark in them. He saw the image of God, his Father and our Father, in that person. And that person has value no matter what physical or emotional or spiritual situation that they're facing. And then finally, he served them as he would want to be served. So the lesson for us is actually pretty simple. And in many ways, we're already doing these things, but we've got to be conscious and intentional about doing them. And so when we encounter poverty, the first thing we need to do is actually notice the person. And by the way, I hope that through all this of what I'm saying, I don't just mean the person who's asking for a handout of money or for a meal. I'm talking about the person who is spiritually poor, who is in despair and depression, whose health is physically failing, that we notice those people in our congregation, in our families, and in our lives. And after we notice them, then we see the Christ in them. We actually put on Christ's eyes and we begin to look at people and say, wow, that's how Christ would want me to look at that person. Not as a statistic, not as a person who's wearing a grubby shirt, not as a person who's just sick, seeing them as Christ would see them. And then lastly, to serve that person as if they were Jesus Christ. There was I forgot where it was, if it was a church that had done it near itself, that on a park bench they had put a bronze statue of Jesus laying on the bench as if he was homeless. And oh my goodness, the stir that it caused. And I thought to myself, I've really got to understand why this caused such a stir. The reason being is because when we think of Christ, we want to think of him on the cross, we want to think of him resurrected and in glory. We never want to think of Jesus as being poor and truly in need. But what did Jesus say to the rich young men one of the people who wanted to follow him? He said, birds of the air have nests, foxes have dens, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Meaning, if you come and follow me, it's not going to be a 5-star hotel. It's not going to be the continental breakfast in the morning. Probably why I wasn't called back in 33 AD or so. This is what Jesus wants us to see. And so just like people had trouble seeing Jesus in need on that bench, we've got to get over that part and begin to see Jesus in need in each of the persons in our lives. And the most basic reason we have to do that is because at some point in our spiritual lives, Jesus saw us, and that's how he reacted. He saw us in need, either physical, emotional, or spiritual. He saw us in despair. He saw us in pain, and he said, I'm not going to be indifferent. I'm not going to judge you or me. I'm just going to serve. So shameless plug, in a couple weeks we're going to be talking about next week we're going to be talking about our stewardship campaign, and the sermon that I'm going to give at that time isn't going to have anything to do with money. It's going to have to do with the stewardship of each and every single person in our congregation and how we choose to serve one another and those people who are not here in this building, but who are in desperate, desperate need of Jesus Christ. So let us not be indifferent, let us not be judgmental, and let us not fall into despair. Jesus himself has shown us the way and the example of how to serve others, if only we look to the left and to the right and recognize that person as Christ. Amen.
Amen.